Systems Managing Exchange 2010 webinar. My name is Tony Greco. I'm a Managing Consultant for Catapult Systems in Houston, Texas. I've been dealing with Microsoft messaging products since MS Mail way back in the bad old days. And let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk today about Microsoft Exchange 2010's management tools. We'll also talk a little bit about management history, what we've had in the past, and how we've grown. We'll go into the graphical user interface a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because it is somewhat obvious. And then we're going to get into role-based access control, remote PowerShell, and auditing. This is about a 30-minute seminar, and we'll be using the question and answer features in live meetings. So if you have any questions, please submit them through that. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the seminar, and I'll try to answer any questions that have come up. Exchange 2010 management has been greatly improved over Exchange 2007. A study was done in June of 2008 by Ferris Research, which determined that the annual cost of help desk support staff for an email system with 7,500 mailboxes is approximately $20 per mailbox. That is a significant amount of money. As the size of an organization shrinks or becomes smaller, that cost goes up. As they get larger, that cost does go down. However, it's not as significant as a lot of folks would think. So with this in mind, Microsoft went out to try to empower some of their specialist users in Exchange 2010. And I know you've all had to deal with somebody who comes up and says, you know what, I need to be able to search everybody's mailbox to find emails related to X conversation. And the only answer that we had in the past really was to give them full rights to the entire enterprise, and, well, that makes me cringe, and I'm sure all of y'all. With Exchange 2010, we can create special roles. For example, a compliance officer who does those legal discovery searches, or a human resources officer so that they're allowed to update employee information in the company directory. Exchange 2010 also attempted to lower support costs by granting certain rights to the user, allowing the user to track status of their sent messages as opposed to asking us if they've gotten there, or they can create and manage their own distribution lists. So in Exchange Server 2003, right, we had the Exchange System Manager, and we use Active Directory domain services, users and computers to access all mail-related attributes. The management tools relied primarily on permissions granted on recipient or configuration objects in the directory service. Management groups were assigned at an organization level, and there were only 3 management groups available: the Exchange Full Administrator, the Exchange Administrator, and the Exchange View-Only Administrator. Not very granular. If we were to try in Exchange 2003 and provide extremely granular access, we were going into ACLs for individual objects. It was extremely painful and hard to manage. In Exchange 2007, this was improved when Exchange Server 2007 introduced new tools for richer management, including the Exchange Management Shell, utilizing PowerShell. The Exchange Management Console and Shell both had increased capabilities. However, the tools still rely on permissions granted on recipient or configuration objects in the directory. In Exchange 2007, instead of 3 management groups, we now had 5. We had the Exchange Organization Administrator, a Recipient Administrator, a View-Only Administrator, a Public Folder Administrator, and a Server Administrator. And yes, those public folders, they keep hanging on. So some of the challenges that we faced where the current management role implementations were entirely too limited. Saying someone's an administrator or not doesn't cover all that we needed. Access control management is complex. If you have tried to go in and grant somebody the right to read through at certain levels and have to change their levels, control at certain levels, it's very complex to do, and it's very hard to maintain, and unfortunately, reporting on it is extremely complex. The permissions were focused on objects and not tasks. And while it's good to have permissions on your objects, I can't just say, you know what, you've got this role, you should have these permissions. Excessive privileges were required for many Exchange operations, and object access auditing and delegated permissions reporting was difficult when you got it to work at all. Nor was there any support for self-service management. So in Exchange 2010, what's new? Well, there's quite a few new features in the Exchange Management Console. The Exchange Control Panel, which is new, is a simplified web-based management console targeted at your end users or your hosted tenants if you're using Exchange Online Services, as well as a few specials. Then we get RBAC, which is Role-Based Access Control. This is an entirely new authorization model. It's easy to delegate and customize, and all Exchange management clients, the Exchange Management Shell, Console, Control Panel, all use RBAC. Remote PowerShell, which is the manages the Exchange remotely using PowerShell version 2.0. All PowerShell now for Exchange goes through the remote PowerShell, even if you're on the same server. And then last but not least is auditing and logging. So supported platforms for Exchange 2010, all of Exchange 2010 is 64-bit only. All the admin tools are 64-bit only. No more 32-bit versions of Exchange for us to install the admin tools on our workstations. Now, for the admin tools, it's going to support Vista 64 SP1 or higher, Windows 2008 64-bit SP2 or higher, or Windows 7 64-bit, and Windows 2008 R2 64-bit or higher. Well, that's as high as we go right now, but that's good. Notice, though, that that is all 64-bit. So remote PowerShell management, it does not require the Exchange binaries at the client. So if I'm on a workstation and I'm running remote PowerShell, I do not need to have the Exchange management binaries loaded at the client. I can use the remote PowerShell on Vista 2008, 2008 R2, 2003, and XP. Again, since I don't need the binaries locally, I can run this on any of those systems. The management GUIs, well, the Exchange Management Console is primarily for on-premise IT pros, your Exchange administrators, right? It's the thick client. It requires that you install the client on the machine or you install it on a terminal server and you connect to it that way. This is the console that we're really used to using in the past. I'm not going to delve into it a whole lot deeper because this is what we're used to seeing. Now, the Exchange Control Panel, the EPC, is primarily for what we call tenant administrators. If you're using the hosted services such as Exchange Online, specialists such as your help desk, your discovery, etc., your end users themselves can use the Exchange Control Panel. This is also where they would see their OLA options, but it's not just your OLA control panel. It is for web browser-based administration and provides simplified access, in some cases, to tasks available to these users. So on the Exchange Management Console, like the previous version that was built on PowerShell, this version is built on remote PowerShell. It does support multiple forests, which is critical in our environments that we're seeing today. It is RBAC aware, remote role-based access control aware user interface, and I'll show you that in just a second. Some of the notable new features are recipient bulk edit. I personally like the ability to just highlight a whole bunch of recipients and edit a single feature on them instead of having to script everything. It does PowerShell command logging. Everything that you do in the console, you can pull the PowerShell commands out. And there are links to the Exchange Management Console from the Exchange Control Panel. Now, this is what I was talking about when I said that it's role-based aware. What we're looking at now is an organization management level console. Somebody who has an organizational management role, Exchange administrator, such as that, would have everything that we see here today, where we've got, if you look over on the left side, you've got organization configuration, server configuration, and recipient configuration. This is normally what we would expect to see in the console. But the next console here is if somebody only has a recipient management level role, right? We've made them just a recipient administrator. You'll note that they have some organization configuration roles on the left side, and below that you'll see the recipient configuration. You'll notice that they have no server configuration capabilities in the console. This is all thanks to role-based access control, RBAC. The console and PowerShell and everything will use RBAC to make sure that you only get the view of the utilities or the tools that you need. Like I said, the Exchange Control Panel is also RBAC aware. It's going to check your user permissions to interface components. A good example in the Exchange Control Panel is the the management drop-down. On the left side there, if you log in as an administrator, you'll see that it says select what to manage, myself, my organization, or another user. This is great for an administrator, but if I'm a client who doesn't have those permissions, I shouldn't even see that drop-down. And on the right side there, you can see that they don't. This limits confusion and only grants people access to the proper scope. So some features of interest for the Exchange Control Panel is Auto Group, which is group and membership management. You now splits across two end-user roles, My Distribution Group Membership and My Distribution Groups. This uses approval framework along with arbitration mailboxes to implement join leave approval process. That's a fancy way of saying I can actually have an approval process where we send emails to grant somebody access to a group. This is a great thing because it means that as a user requests or as somebody attempts to grant them access into that group, instead of having to call Bob up and say, hey, Bob, can you grant them in, there's an automated process in place that will send them an email whereby simply selecting allow or deny, they can allow or deny that person access to that group. We now have delivery ports, which is previously known as message tracking. There are end user and administrator scenarios. The end user can track their email messages, and that's it. An administrator, of course, can track everybody's. There are links from the Exchange Management Console and from Outlook 2010. Obviously, the links from Outlook 2010 are more meant for the end user himself to track that information. We can manage another user's Outlook web access options if we're an administrator. We have that role, or we have the role for managing end users. We can target user role assignments to dictate the result instead of management rights. If the user can't change their display name, then neither can you. You would actually have to be at a higher level to do that. So let's talk about RBAC, because I know we've mentioned it a couple of times. Let's talk about some advantages and components of RBAC. RBAC was role-based access control. This differs greatly from your old ACLs, your access control list, that use traditional discretionary access control. The main thing to know here is that RBAC assigns permissions to specific operations with meaning in an organization, rather than to the low-level data objects themselves. There's an excellent wiki article that you can find. I've got the link up there, and I believe these are made available to you later. With role-based access control, it simplifies control of administration. Simply being allowed to choose a role to grant someone as opposed to have to go ahead and modify each and every access level that we want makes it much easier to administer. It provides much better manageability in an enterprise environment. With RBAC, we created a new object called a role. You create the role. You assign users to the role. The roles are mapped to application permissions. In most cases, there are minimal changes to role permissions. As a matter of fact, typically once you put them in place, there will be no changes to them unless you have like a major divestiture or change in your IT process. Some advantages of RBAC. All right, it simplifies access control model because it's defined on management roles and not on individual access to objects. Customized roles can be created to meet specific needs of an organization. No two organizations are exactly alike. And while there are some great general roles built in there, I would say probably about half the organizations will create a specific role that is not covered. Excuse me. Access can be scoped to specific objects in the domain and configuration network computers, meaning I can say not only do you only have these rights, but you only have these rights to these users in this OU. And users in another OU, you don't, or users on this Exchange server, or users in this organization. Enforcement of access control is maintained organization-wide through all administrative interfaces. So it really doesn't matter whether you're using the Exchange Control Panel, the Exchange Management Console, PowerShell. Role-based access control is applied to all of those. Now, there's granular control of tasks at a command parameter level is possible. Like some of the many possible things out there, I recommend being very sparing with this because it becomes difficult to manage. One of the best things that I like about this implementation of RBAC is reporting is available for determining the level of access control that is in place. I can go to an individual object and say, show me what your access control is. So I can see an individual users, I can take a look at a role and tell me what that is, much like resultant set of policy. If you're used to using group policy objects, we have the capability to drill down and see what it's going to be like for an end user. I kept this diagram in here. You know, we've got three things that we need to worry about, right? We've got the users, our USGs, right? Universal Security Groups. That's the who. We've got the role, what, what can they do, and we've got the scope, which is where, and that's where our role assignment comes in place. It puts together our who with the what and the where. I just wanted to throw this up here. I would love to go into RBAC a little deeper than I have now. However, I can spend an hour or two or three talking about RBAC alone, so I just want to throw the components up there. Right, there's the management role itself, which includes a bunch of commandlets and parameters, some scripts, an implicit domain scope type, and an implicit configuration scope type. Two different scope types there. In the management role assignment, we've got the management role type, which user or user groups or policies are applied to this. We've got domain right restrictions and config scope restrictions. Scope restrictions can be either an organizational unit or a filter. Only allow people whose name ends with S. Well, you wouldn't obviously do that, but any of the filters that we're used to creating, we can use. Scope restrictions, server filters, right? We want to filter for these 5 explicit servers, or all servers in this OU, or servers ending in MB, because that's how we define mailbox servers. And then role assignment policy. Now, some of the other Exchange administrative tools that we've mentioned here, right, we've got all of them are using the Exchange 2010 remote PowerShell. Not PowerShell, remote PowerShell. So, obviously Exchange Management Shell is going to be the remote PowerShell, the Exchange Management Console, and the Exchange Control Panel. All of those, by the way, especially in the Management Console, will log the PowerShell commands that it's issuing when you do a task. So you can capture those and do them directly in PowerShell. Remote PowerShell is used because we need to ensure that all tasks pass through the RBAC code. And what I mean by that is that when you run a remote PowerShell command, it actually runs on the Exchange server, which is running the RBAC code. And so any task that you attempt to do through PowerShell will first have to get authorized through the RBAC control. You can restrict a PowerShell session so that it will allow RBAC to hide commandlets and parameters. So if you don't have the permissions in RBAC or in your role to do a set mailbox, that commandlet will no longer show up in PowerShell. It is a separation of client-server. The remote PowerShell is always used to connect remotely to the local host. So even if I'm on the Exchange server itself and I launch my Exchange Management Shell it's still launching a remote PowerShell session. This enables firewall and cross-forest scenarios so that we only have the standard protocol of HTTPS. I hope you use HTTPS. And there are no binaries needed. Right now, to do Exchange management on a client, we have to go ahead and load the Exchange Management Console Exchange Management Shell on the client itself. Well, with the remote PowerShell feature, we don't have to do that anymore. The the Exchange commandlet management from a client machine, which does not have Exchange management tools installed, is possible. And we're going to actually show you that in a second here. So how does remote PowerShell work? Well, let's say Evan, our intrepid administrator, is sitting on his workstation, and he sees what remote commandlets are available. Well, he's got the commandlet new PS session. He runs that. He connects to IIS. Now, a remote PowerShell connects to IIS on the Exchange servers. You have to have it running. There's no way around that. It does an IIS authentication, which brings up the Windows Security Management and the RBAC stack, which does authorization against Active Directory. Evan has a role assignment, and which commandlets that are available to him are enumerated. And he creates a new PowerShell version 2 run space. So he's actually opened the session on the remote server. And he has, you'll notice that the commandlets that he got in his role assignment are the commandlets that are available in his run space. There we go. And then the remote commandlets that are available to him now show up. He'll issue the command, in this case the new mailbox dash name Bob. It executes in the run space. And then it pipes the results out back to the remote client. So how do you use PowerShell? Well, there are a couple things you need to know. I'm sure you're familiar with, if you've used PowerShell, getting credentials, right? The $ user credential equals get credential. Obviously, the $user credential is the variable that we're piping in get credential. $RS equal new PS session. And then all of that configuration that goes with it. The one thing to point out is that the connection point is the HTTPS server name / PowerShell. And then we pass in the credential. And then we do import the session. If we're on premise, if we're actually on the Exchange Management server and we open the Exchange Management shell icon, it's going to do all of that in the background anyway. So it's still a remote session even if you're on the server. So I'm going to actually just run through, give you an example here. All right. I open my PowerShell dialog. There are no Exchange Management tools loaded on my machine. I issue get mailbox, and I get the term get mailbox is not recognized as a commandlet. That's because I don't have the tools, the binaries loaded on my machine. What I'll do next, I'll issue the get credential command. That's the $user credential equal get credential. It pops up the dialog box. I enter in my credentials, stores it in that variable. Then I'm going to add all the information for the remote PowerShell session, right? And that's the endpoint and the credentials. In this case, my endpoint is https://slc-ex01.contoso.com/PowerShell. That's my server, slc-ex01. All right, and then we're passing the credentials $user credential. And you'll note the next step is to import the PS session-RS. In the previous session, we really just defined the variable. And it's going to come up and pop up and tell me that the proxy creation has been skipped for the following commands. We could define each and all of these, and in a longer running session, I probably would do so. I don't have to for each of them. You notice, though, that it instantiates a new PowerShell session and gives me all the information on that. Now the session is open on the server side, and if I run the get mailbox command, I'm getting my answer. extremely powerful because I can do this from any machine, anywhere, as long as I can remember all of those commands up there when we set RS equals. Now, me personally, I'm not going to remember all that. I'm going to put that in a file somewhere and just execute it. And so going from there, we'll talk about auditing briefly. Exchange 2010 allows auditing for any executed commandlet by any user or administrator, whether it's through the Exchange Management Console, the Exchange Control Panel, or the Management Shell. So any executed commandlet. And again, if you're in one of the GUIs, you're still executing the commandlet because it's simply translating that to PowerShell and executing it. It is managed via the admin audit log config. There's a list of all commandlets and parameters to audit. The default is all. It can be quite extensive. All of the auditing is sent to a mailbox used to store the logging information. It's not just dumped to a text file. Get commandlets are not logged. Since they're not making changes to the environment, we're not logging them. They have no authoritative power to do anything. We'll let gets go by. The settings are global and stored in the directory. And remember, global means anywhere in our organization, so we can't audit this server and not that server. The events are discoverable using your normal search tools that you use to search through your inbox or to search the Exchange. Just give you an example of what the auditing returns. This is an example of someone doing a set mailbox command for, just following along here, does a set mailbox command for Joe Doe, setting his max send size to 10 meg, and it tells you that the administrator did it, Contoso WAC administrator, and it did succeed and there were no errors. So for each and every commandlet issued, you're going to see one of these messages in the auditor's mailbox. So at this time, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions. Please use the live meeting question and answer tools. And the first question that we have is on remote PowerShell. And I'm going to go back up to that slide here. And the question that we asked was, why are we doing the $RS equals new PS session, blah, 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 blah. That whole long link, and then calling it in the import-PS session. It's not necessary to do that. You could actually encapsulate it. However, as a good method for using PowerShell, you need to get used to encapsulating these commands on separate lines and putting them into variables. In this case, if you were to do the import PS session, you would actually have to, I can't remember if you'd have to put the whole thing in double quotes, single quotes, unless you had no spaces in any of your names. Okay, do we have any other questions? All right, one more question here, going back up to, the Exchange Control Panel, if I can get back up that far. The question on the Exchange Control Panel was, how does the Exchange Control Panel know what you're supposed to be able to manage, whether you're able to manage yourself or other users? That is through RBAC, through setting a role. So when you log into the Exchange Control Panel, one of the things that it does is the Exchange Services checks through the Windows Security Management Interface and the RBAC code and finds out what roles you have available to you, and depending upon that role will tell you exactly what is supposed to be available in the Exchange Control Panel. So if you have an administrator role or you have a user manager role, then you would see this drop down like we have on the control panel here. If you only were just a user or did not have an administrative role for other users, say you only had server manager, then you wouldn't see anything in that drop. You wouldn't even see the drop down itself. Okay, we'll just give it another minute here if we have any other questions. Okay, no other questions at this time. Thank you for joining the Catapult Systems Exchange 2010 Management Tool seminar. And if you have any further questions beyond this, please feel free to contact your local Catapult Systems office. Wait a minute, I have a question. Thought I had a question. Well, I have somebody who's raised their hand. If you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A session. There we go. Is there a way to audit the GET at all? No, the GET commands are not audited at all. And the reason for that is any time that you enumerate or you open the management console, the GET commands would just be too prolific, and I think that they decided not to audit the GET commands at that time.
The leader has unmuted your line.
There we go. I got the lines unmuted, so if you have any questions, just hang out. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, if there are no further questions, thank you, and everyone have a good evening.